Usually when I give a lecture somewhere, I say I'm very glad to be here. And usually I am. This time it wouldn't be true. The only reason I'm here is because I promised to do so. And I certainly would have not have come here if I had not promised, after seeing the voluminous literature which has been appearing in connection with this meeting. I'm used to being told that I'm wrong. I'm used to being told that I'm too abstract. I'm used to people disagreeing with me. And sometimes I am wrong and am too abstract. I'm not clear. I'm not used to being called a liar, or being called incompetent, or being called a fascist. And this sort of thing makes me very unhappy to come to places where this is the nature of the kind of things going on. I was also warned, apparently unnecessarily, so far everything is behaving very well. I was told this is liable to be a shouting match rather than a debate. And I'm willing to concede right at the beginning that I'm not able to shout as loud as some others. I'm willing to bow out to this to be the kind of thing. However, I am here, and I am a teacher, and I like to teach, and so I will take a few minutes to talk about something which I know something about, which I think I have some competence in spite of all the letters in the press here. And I will not try to deal with four problems, which is apparently what the people who organized this debate wanted me to do. Instead, I will try to lay down what seems to me the basic propositions of the nature of the new economic policy produced by President Nixon, and the things which I think it can achieve. One more word before I go on to that. In the course of the discussion, letters, and the broadside, I've also been accused of being a kind of sadist. That is, that I love to reduce the standard of living of the working people, to grind their faces in the dust, I think is the proper expression for this. And that is because I have been against increasing wages, and in fact, on some occasions, I have proposed a decrease in wages. Now, in the context, this must be understood, that I did not believe ever that this decrease in wages would make the workers any poorer or have less things to eat. It was clearly understood that it was a decrease in money wages which would make it avoid the inflation, so that they would be just as well off with the wage, with the lower money wage, as with the higher money wage. The most important difference being that there would be more work for more people, which I am in favor of. But I thought this should not be necessary to emphasize, but apparently it is necessary, judging by the letters, etc. Now, what is the new economic policy? There are a few very simple propositions, which seem to be disputed by the people who organized this meeting, with arguments to which my normal response is, why don't you learn this economics? We're having an inflation in which prices are rising. Inflation often happen because people are spending too much money trying to buy more than is available to be bought. Whenever this happens, the prices have to rise, and if that is the nature of the inflation, the cure for it is to remove the cause, which is usually the way of curing anything satisfactorily. And in this case, the cause would be that there is too much spending, and this can be done by the government taking money away from people so they shouldn't be able to spend so much, and then they'll be able to buy the same thing without the increase in prices. This, however, is not the nature of the inflation we are having now. It does not make sense to say that there is too much spending when we're having 6% unemployed, when we have managed not long ago with only 3.5% unemployed. We have more unemployed because the spending is not enough to buy all the goods which could be produced, which is why people are not producing them. since the employers will not employ people to make goods which they can't sell. There is not enough spending. So we cannot say the inflation is due to too much spending. It is then due to something else. What it is due to is the power of the sellers, not of the buyers, to raise the prices. The workers raise the wages, the employers raise the prices. The employers agree to pay the higher money wages because they can pass it on in charging higher prices. And they each blame each other, and possibly even quite sincerely. The employers say we must raise the prices because our costs are going up, and they are, because the wages are rising. And the representatives of the workers say we must raise our wages because the prices are going up. And that is also true. And so we have each blaming each other, and you have to find out which came first, chicken or the egg, and of course there's no sensible answer in doing that. What needs to be done is to remove the cause. The cause is the pressure of wages and of prices to go up because of the bargaining power which the workers have and because of the market power which the businessmen have. And the attempt by the new economic policy is to curtail this power, the result of which would be to check the inflation. That is not the most important part of it. The thing is serious not because of the inflation, which at the present rate doesn't do any terrible harm. Other countries are managing with much greater inflation and having greater prosperity and employment, which is more important than that prices are rising. The really important thing is that the attempt to stop the inflation is taking place by people who think it is the first kind of inflation, that it is due to too much spending. And so measures have been taken by the government, by the central bank, to cut down on the total amount of spending on the ground that this is supposed to be the cause of the inflation. The result of that is that there is less spending, and there wasn't too much, and now there is too little. And so we have the unemployment as the worst result of the inflation, even though it is due to the cure rather than to the disease. But the cure is worse than the disease, and we are in a situation where, in order to remove the cure, we have to remove the disease. To remove the disease, we have to regulate wages and prices to stop them from rising the way they do. And if we succeed in that, we can then take measures to increase the total amount of spending, because there will not then be so many people who will say, you mustn't do that because it's inflationary. And then you will have more employment, more jobs for everybody, and this is the reason why I think it would be a good idea to check increases in wages and in prices. Now, I probably have used up the time which I have, or do I have some more time? Oh, good. What is needed then is to do something to stop this, and then we can have a policy of increasing the total amount of spending. Now these things are being done extremely badly by the present government. When the new economic policy was first spelled out, announced, it included the suggestion that steps would be taken to increase total spending, to increase the number of jobs. This has not been done. It was not done because of the very same pressures which brought about the depression in the first place. And people said, oh, it's inflationary to have a deficit. And so while the president tried to increase total spending by cutting certain taxes, by no means the best taxes, he also was induced to cut certain expenditures so as to avoid too big a deficit. And these are things which I criticize what is being done. I'm also critical of many other things. But one thing which I do want to stress, again as a result of the enormous publicity and the kind publicity that this was given here, is that if I agree with something which somebody does, it is not true, and I think it is improper, indecent. For people to assume that therefore I agree with everything that those people do. Because I agree with the Nixon economic policy, it does not mean that I agree with the Vietnam War. Because I agree with what was done in Brazil to check the inflation, it doesn't mean I'm in favor of the fascist dictatorship which they have there. And all those suggestions are the kind of thing which made me most reluctant to come here. But perhaps these were just a kind of rhetoric, and I think I can understand why that kind of rhetoric takes place. It takes place among people who are extraordinarily ignorant of economics, and at the same time supremely confident that they have the answers which nobody else knows. I have not met my protagonist today. He looks like a decent gentleman. I have read a 4-newspaper column expounding his views. I found in there a number of quite keen insights, and also a number of quite extraordinary elementary mistakes in economics. I hope you will forgive me for plagiarizing it. I took a piece out of his article and gave it to one of my classes in their examination. Let me give you an illustration of this kind of argument, which makes me think that debating is not really the way to deal with this kind of issue. I used to go to debates a lot. I'm very fond of debating. I'm a bit out of practice now because I've been teaching instead. There is a large difference between debating and teaching. The best debates are those which are completely meaningless. I remember a marvelous debate I once spoiled. The debate was as to whether all actions are selfish. And those in favor of it said, even if a mother gives away her last crust of bread to the child, she does it because that's what she wants to do, and therefore she is being selfish. And of course you can see this is a very useful sort of thing. The best debates are useless. They're more like the nature of a fight. They're very good for showing off your pyrotechnics in speech, and I enjoy that too. It's one of the sports which I go in for. But it is not enlightening. And I think that those who are interested in these topics would do much better, instead of having debates, to go and learn some economics, maybe read some books about it. Thank you.
The next speaker will be Lynn Marcus, revolutionary socialist, national chairman of the National Caucus of the Labor Committees, author of Third Stage Imperialism and Philosophy of Socialist Education, and a forthcoming work, Dialectical Economics. Mr. Marcus.
The trouble with heat, which Professor Lerner doesn't seem to grasp, is that in the ordinary course of events, economic teaching in universities is more like the practice of a priesthood than anything to do with reality. It's simply something you learn. You don't use it in business much. Point of fact, most business economists or most practicing economics in business do not have an economics training, but usually in industrial engineering or some other type of training. However, in the course of a crisis, these abstractions, which are the priestly affairs of economic education, which you have to learn to pass the course primarily, become something more than abstractions. They become something relating to concrete policies which affect the lives of people. And they have consequences for people. And thus people who are too divorced from reality, seeing these abstractions merely as innocent intellectual toys, lack a grasp of the blood concreteness that these abstractions sometimes lead to in practice. And therefore, since the lives and well-beings of millions and even billions of people are at stake, that an error in the domain of abstraction is not an intellectual error. It can be a bloody crime against humanity. A professor who says innocently, the economy, from my point of view, would be better organized if certain administrative arrangements were made, does not necessarily think out to the kind of administrative arrangements which in practice realize that very innocent practice. Professor Lerner may attempt to divorce his economic policies from the policies of the government of Brazil and see them in abstraction and detachment from that. However, you cannot carry out the economic policies which are recommended for Brazil without having the kind of government which makes those economic policies work. You could not have the kind of policies which are recommended, which he's recommended as a classic austerity policy for increased unemployment. Now, it is classic in the sense that this is precisely the policy of shock from 1933 on in Germany, in which wages were frozen to prevent the inflation and in order to increase employment. He may personally detach himself from that, but it's not possible for the politicians to accept his advice to detach themselves from the kind of government and the kind of procedures which enable those abstractions to become reality. And that has to be grasped, because now no longer is economics merely a plaything of an obscure corner of the academic priesthood. Now economic policy is that which determines the lives and daily lives and conditions of people. The form of economic policy determines the kind of government which is necessary to carry it out. And the only kind of government which can carry out the kind of policy which Professor Lerner recommends in all well-meaning, all good intention, would have to be a Bonapartist or fascist government. He may be opposed to fascism with every fiber of his being. This was also true in Germany, where many economists, liberal economists, who proposed austerity, were also opposed to the Nazi regime. But nonetheless, there are men who will take up these policies and carry them out, and they will be Bonapartists or fascists, but not Professor Lerner. So he must understand that sometimes his good intentions do not ensure that his policies carried into practice will work out as he sees them in human terms. Now, to put the whole problem into concrete focus, this is not a national problem, it's a world economic problem. Right now, whether there's a depression before Christmas or January, or one later in 1972, seems to hinge upon decisions which will be made, according to reports, 2 weeks from now in Washington, when the Group of 10 again meets, and attempt to see if they can come up with the kind of policy which is agreeable to both the Europeans, Japanese, and to that amateur economist, most amateur, from Texas, Treasury Secretary Conway. Now, what's the possibility? Because this tells you, the reason I go to this is because this is the only way you can understand what we're facing right here. What Connolly has proposed to do, finally, if his rhetoric means anything, is Connolly has proposed to do what, to a certain degree, what most rational economists would have proposed at August 15th in any case. And some degree of confidence which swelled around the world as of August 15th was based on the assumption that the Nixon administration was going to finally do something of this sort. And then after several months it became clear the Nixon administration was not. Europeans called Connolly all sorts of bad names in public, which is not the sort of things that parliamentarians usually do. And Senator Javits in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, began to say bad things about Treasury Secretary Connolly too. And under tremendous pressure from banking circles in this country, as well as from Europe, finally the imminent catastrophe which would flow from the continuation of Connolly's former policies got home to the Nixon administration, maybe for political reasons rather than rational reasons, and finally at least it is attempted to put a show of moving in the direction demanded by the Europeans, which is more or less rational from their standpoint. Would it solve the problem? It would not. What it would do would prevent an immediate depression. If, for example, 2 weeks from now, the Group of 10 came out with no meeting, with no agreement, then this would destroy confidence in the capitalist economy throughout the world, and it would mean blocks and sectors would tend to go each way, each trying to defend themselves against the effect of the competition from other sectors. In other words, an unraveling of the world economy and a world trade crisis, and an immediate replay, to the extent that there is any replay in history, of 1931 onward, particularly what happened about 6 months after the London, or the British decision to float the pound in September 1931. What will happen probably is that they will, at this stage, agree, or at least we can assume that that's the most rational course of action for them, and it now seems that Connolly has finally gotten the word. There will probably be a 7 to 10% devaluation of the dollar, which means there has to be a gold devaluation in some term or other, otherwise it's meaningless. Otherwise you simply have a float on top of a float, and there will be adjustments in other currencies. What the effect of this will be to turn the International Monetary Fund into something of an engine of inflation and stability in international trade. These people are not willing to go to what the abstract monetary and fiscal economists would recommend for the world at this stage, is to turn the IMF into, in fact, a central reserve system for the entire world. That is, all currencies, dollars and so forth, gold to be turned over to the IMF, much the same way that gold was turned over to the Federal Reserve System in this country to get a stable currency. They won't do that for political reasons, but some approximation of that to make the SDRs a international reserve unit for trade to somewhat replace the dollars will be the probable course of events if the optimal variant is taken at the meeting 2 weeks from now. Now, would this mean, and most people who are sanguine about the results of such an agreement would argue that this is the case, does this mean that there's going to be a return to the conditions existing, say, before March of this past year when this unraveling process started? Or does it mean that simply is merely a postponement of this crisis for a short period of time until some new monetary break brings a repetition which is more difficult to cope with than the one of this past August, leading into an immediate depression? The latter possibility happens to be the more likely. The reason is simple, is that in order to maintain a stable world economy, all advanced sectors in some productive state, it would be necessary for the International Monetary Fund to begin to generate credit to take the place of the U.S. role in generating credit to sustain world trade and expansion over a previous period. The Connolly proposal to stabilize the world system by getting the other advanced sector nations to contribute first 13 billion, now reduced to 9 billion, to the U.S. balance of payments situation would not solve the problem. A stable U.S. currency based on that is a mare's nest. It's a fool's errand. Because if the U.S. succeeds in extracting from the rest of the world even $9 billion in trade concessions, this means depressive conditions throughout the rest of the capitalist sector, particularly upon those sectors such as West Germany, Japan, the Dutch, which have the largest export component. Something very much like what happened to Germany and to other nations after 1929, particularly after 1931. So that to the extent that the U.S. stabilizes the dollar by this kind of short-term measure, accompanied perhaps by $30 billion repatriated from Europe into the U.S., which would be an inflationary measure. To that extent, there is absolutely no solution to the U.S. or to Europe, because to depress Europe and Japan, to create depression conditions in Europe and Japan, pulls the plug out under the entire international monetary system, and when that begins to go, the dollar goes with it. So what Connolly has proposed is no solution at all. Now, this brings us to what Professor Lerner talked about. The monetary expansion process is no solution, precisely because the present crisis was caused by an exhaustion of the capacity for further monetary expansion of that type. And to attempt to return to it, except on a very modest basis for a short period, is impossible. So it comes down to, if you can't have an inflationary monetary expansion, where do you get the money with which to stabilize the capitalist system? That is, where do you get the funds to maintain the current required levels of profit, debt service, and rental payments throughout the capitalist system necessary to sustain the value of stocks, bonds, acceptances, and so forth? If you're not expanding the monetary system, then you must get the payments out of the existing monetary flows based on existing levels of production. This means that profit, debt service, and rent can be increased only at the expense of two other sectors. These are respectively primarily the wage sector and secondarily the farm sector. Therefore, what happens in a period like this is that in order to maintain the capitalist system, not the ability to produce, but in order to maintain the capitalist system, it dictates an assault primarily on wages for the purpose of increasing or maintaining payments to the account of profit, debt service, and rent. So the old classic class struggle, in which the general interests of working people and farmers to a lesser degree, because the attack on farmers will be somewhat less immediately, against those who represent the interests of profit on stocks, debt service on bonds and other forms of debt, acceptances and so forth, and rent, are locked in a struggle. One must survive at the expense of the other. Now, to say the false theory on which Professor Lerner's argument is predicated is that the cause of post-war inflation is the rise of wages of productive workers, especially trade union workers. This is essentially a nonsense argument. It is not the case. The thing which causes, there are two things which cause inflation, or this type of inflation, that tended to cause it since about 1870. That is, ask the question, if at the point of production, as opposed to average wage earners, the rate of increased productivity has been in the order of magnitude of 7% per annum. That's at the point of production, operatives only, not white-collar administrators and servants. Then how is it that the cost of the commodities which are produced under these conditions of rising productivity do not decline, the price of commodities do not decline, rather than rise? There's one simple reason, or there are two interrelated reasons. The first reason is the expansion of the monetary system and the growth of debt, such that the major cause of inflation with the increased productivity, a productivity increase which is much greater than the rise in wages at the point of production, is due to the debt service and profits on purely fictitious instruments which is assigned as a burden to production. Thus, the major cost of, or the major reason for rising prices, for inflation, has nothing to do with wages as such, but has to do with debt service directly and indirectly put on production. A major part of this is, of course, the government financing, which through taxation, other measures, adds to this and becomes a per unit added charge to production. A further factor is that the structural features of the economy are changed to cause a structural inflation. That is, productive employment stagnates, as has been the case in the United States since 1953. Whereas the growth of administrative services tied to this apparatus of capital expansion, paper capital expansion, generates expansion in both administrative employment and in services which are key to wage levels and employment in administrative employment. This means that a major section of the U.S. population, wage-earning population, is shifted from productive to non-productive employment. And these are the causes of inflation. Potentially, in terms of real economy, we could have a shift toward production, productive employment, and very easily solve this problem. We can only take the paper, which stands for fictitious values, the rising debt, which is essentially based on fictitious values, stock values, which are based on fictitious values, rents based on fictitious values. You just take this out and burn it and reconstitute the economy. There's no reason we couldn't have full employment and full productivity. But when you accept the capitalist system, which means to accept the legitimacy, the juridical legitimacy of these instruments, these inflated, worthless instruments, stocks, bonds, mortgages, etc., and you demand that you maintain the integrity of these, what you're doing is you're asking to maintain the fictitious element of the economy at the expense of the productive element. And therefore the reasoning becomes to depress wages, to gouge wages, in order to maintain payments on profit, debt service, and rent. And that's exactly what the fight is about. Now, the only solution, whatever Professor Lerner's intentions, and I'm not addressing myself to his intentions, is the kind of solution he's proposing is precisely the kind of solution which was discovered by the German financiers in 1933, was implemented by Schacht, to reduce wages, that is to fix them at the level of 1933, depression levels in Germany, as a means for expanding employment. And this is precisely the pattern I suggest throughout the world today.
There will be a 5-minute rebuttal by each man, if they so wish.
I was delighted and surprised by Mr. Marcus's talk. I was expecting it, more of it to be the kind of criticism which comes from the left, but about 50% of it was just the kind of argument which I was engaged in a long time ago in arguing against those people who were infatuated with gold. and who believe that gold is the basis for everything. Now, most people, middle, left, and everybody except the extreme right, have given up this belief in gold. And this is possible because of their recognizing one thing which I did mention before. Essentially, the difference between cutting money wages and cutting real wages. Now, what I have been talking about, what I have proposed, what is Nixon's policy, does not involve the impoverishment of the workers. It does not mean austerity at all. It's complete misunderstanding to take the holding down of money wages as meaning austerity. It means exactly the opposite. It means the prices will not rise, the money will not increase, and more people will have jobs. Now, can more people have jobs? There were people, especially in the 1930s, and they were responsible for the Great Depression of the 30s, who said it is wicked, it is wrong, it is impossible to create more money unless there is gold buried somewhere to back it. We have escaped from that, and one of the evidences of this escape was the fact that from 1961 till 1969, we had the longest period of maintained prosperity in this country that ever existed. Without the workers or the fruit of farmers. If there's a shortage of money, you can print money. This was a great discovery of Keynes, which I've been active in teaching students for a long time. I may be wrong. I'm willing to listen to arguments. But the complicated arguments put forward today are based upon a mix-up of the ancient superstitions of the classical economists, somehow tied into saying this is due to capitalism. I think I would agree with that if by capitalism I mean the kind of behavior or policy which was responsible for the depression of the 30s. We said we must not print any more money even if it is needed because we don't have the gold. Now, among the people who escaped from this, and I'm afraid I can't help it, was Adolf Hitler, who in fact increased prosperity in Germany, gave people jobs, and he did so. I don't think it is funny, because it's very unfortunate, because these good things led to people supporting him to do the terrible things he did afterwards. But I cannot refrain from saying that he did do that. He did. This kind of argument I don't like.
Right on with
Thank you.
Actually, there's a confusion about gold, which I'll deal with particularly. I'll just make 2 points. But first of all,
can be backed against the future as well as against the present holdings. So if there is future real production to meet this promissory note, all is fine. However, if production is declining relative to the rate of expansion of these promissory notes, then obviously what you get into is simply a process of refinancing promissory notes. And when this refinancing process reaches the point of inflation, that it threatens long-term credit, then the refinancing of these promissory notes means the conversion, or a tendency conversion, of long-term credit into short-term credit. And that, of course, leads to bankruptcy, which is precisely the problem we face. And when you get bankrupt, you hawk somebody. Maybe your grandmother, if you're a certain kind of businessman. And essentially what the capitalist system is proposing to do is to hawk the wages of the working class to pay these promissory notes under conditions in which it is no longer possible to issue the damn thing. That's precisely what Jacques did. As I said, Professor Lerner attempts to divorce again Jacques' proposal from the kind of government that Jacques represented. The reason the German financiers supported Hitler was not because they had any enamorment for Hitler. No capitalist, no financier, no Rockefeller wants some pig like Goering coming in and grabbing up whole sections of his industry, or support legions of SS grafters. But in fact, the only way in which the policy that Professor Lerner proposes can be implemented, and enough people are won to it, if there is a fascist movement in the United States, then the American financiers will support it just as they did Hitler. Not because the abstraction itself seems to imply a fascist state, but in order to impose these kinds of austerity policies on the working class has to be atomized and suppressed. And there's only, under modern systems, there are only 2 kinds of government which do that. In an underdeveloped country, you can do it with a Bonapartist regime like that in Brazil. In the advanced sector, where you have a very large working class, which is well organized, which has a trade union tradition, you can break the working class only by atomizing it and suppressing it. And therefore, the only way that the kind of policy that Professor Lerner is talking about can be carried out is by a Brüning and von Papen regime succeeded by a Hitler regime, or its equivalent in the U.S. And that's what the practical issue is. As far as the economic issues as such, of course, there are many things he raises which are much more involved and involve the whole comparison of Marxian economics with the brand X which is generally taught. But that's a longer discussion.
We have about 10 more minutes in this room. I'll throw the panel open to questions. I'll ask you to try to make your questions as direct and brief as possible. Maybe I'll move from one wing to the other. Somebody on the left, your right, my left, a question? Mitch, you're always trying to stop things.
I would like to ask Professor Lerner why he doesn't recommend any change in the profit or in the tax rate that the business establishment is received with recent increase.
Why don't I recommend other tax changes? I do. But this is not the topic of discussion. I think, for example, as I hinted at perhaps too briefly, the attempt by Nixon administration now to increase total spending by increasing the benefits to investors is a mistaken one. It's not going to have much effect since there's a lot of unused capacity. It will make much more sense to give some money to poor people who would spend it. I'm all in favor of that. And therefore, there's no question relevant to this issue. I'm not trying to deal with all problems.
Mr. Marcus has said that the policies advocated by Mr. Lerner are an austerity policy of a sort that cannot be carried out except by repression. Mr. Lerner has said that it is not an austerity policy if you propose to reduce money wages but not real wages. Now, Mr. Marcus has not spoken directly to that point. They're just familiar with the point.
Professor Lerner referred to this real wage, money wage problem. He identified what I call classically an austerity policy as opposed to a strictly deflationary policy. That is, he proposed to reduce wages in order to make it possible to increase employment, proposing that this structural change in the pattern of employment and production will increase the total real tangible output, commodity output of the economy, and thus increase the content of the dollar, which he hopes would ultimately lead to a higher value content of the dollar, and thus his proposed devaluation would not be a real wage reduction in the long run. And that would apparently work. As a matter of fact, if I were running the economy, which would mean we would have a different kind of society at this stage, we would do something which might resemble that, though without any reduction in wages, which is simply to take over the whole financial structure and issue credit for expansionary production on that basis, making structural changes in employment from non-productive to productive things. It would do very much like that. So that if you look at the real content of the economy, particularly the arms sector, which is a potential capital goods producing sector, together with the 25% underutilization of capacity, is very obvious. From a real standpoint, that something could be done very immediately to increase the content of the purchasing dollar, even with reduced dollar. That's not the problem. The problem is as long as you maintain the capitalist system, the value of stocks, the value of fixed debt, which is a very large constituent of this system at present, the rental values are going to demand to be maintained. Therefore, what's going to happen if you devalue the dollar, you're going to take an increasing proportion of total payments in the economy to pay debt service, profit, and rent. Now, what he proposes is perfectly sound and can be done in the socialist economy. But you can't do it in the capitalist economy unless you're prepared to make a forced devaluation of stocks, bonds, and rent in a greater proportion than you are wages. And now the problem is this: technically it would be conceivable to have, purely abstractly, such a reform, in which a government saying we don't want to have socialism, therefore we'll do something else, will maintain the capitalist system by reducing the value of stocks, putting a ceiling on dividends, putting a ceiling on retained earnings, putting a ceiling on bond payments, reducing them, and reducing rent, and reducing wages only somewhat less. Under that kind of arrangement, his policy might have some kind of viability to it. However, no capitalist government is capable of doing that. First of all, because this, in effect, would anyway trigger off a depression, unless you had a total administrative approach to the economy. And no capitalist government is capable of existing and doing it. In short, the social and political conditions necessary to do that kind of reform, which is the only way it can be done under the capitalist system, technically, would be the social conditions under which you would have a workers' economy come into being. And thus, to the extent that he's proposing this as a reform within the capitalist system, it can't work. Because he's ignored the problem of the proportionality of the economy which result in terms of profit, debt service, and interest.
I think Mr. Lerner wants to answer the question. I think I want to add two things. I want to make some minor corrections. First of all, I insist that I am not proposing austerity. And this is going to change the meaning of the word, call it austerity, whatever I'm proposing. I'm proposing not to make workers poorer, but to do what is necessary under the present conditions to make them better off by having more jobs. Secondly, I'm not proposing to increase the value or the purchasing power of the dollar. I'm only proposing to stop the dollar from becoming worth less. And I'm suggesting that it is something like the present proposal, which will have wages increasing by as much as productivity. I would prefer that. It is about 3% instead of the 5.5% being proposed now. This is a minor difference. As to Mr. Marcus is saying that he would do something in a socialist society, what he's proposing he would do is really very similar to what I am proposing. I just don't know why you have to leave that side of the society in order to do it. You can do it now. It can be done. It has been done. It was done every time there was an improvement in the economic conditions of the country. More money was created. A great fuss was made by Mr. Marcus about the accumulation of debt. One should remember that the national debt, which I don't think is a serious matter anyway, but if you are worried about it, you should notice that it has decreased from being about 115% of the gross national product to something like 40 to 45% of the gross national product now. But of course, if you never look at the real content, it's only the money, in dollars it is more than it ever has been. I think it is more important to look at the real thing. Why I want to talk about real wages? There's one thing which I agree with Mr. Marcus. It is not likely that it is possible in a capitalist society to make a large reduction in the share of the product going to capitalists. I myself would like to reduce the share going to capitalists and increase the share going to workers. More accurately, I would rather increase the income of the poor, whether they're workers or not. I'm against poverty. But if people are less against poverty than they are against the rich, you get a different proposal. Now, I think that the way to improve the condition of the poor is not to be found in taking it away from the rich. The rich have been having about a quarter of the total product, and under the capitalist society will probably continue to do so. It is conceivable that we might take away from this 25%, maybe 10% at the most, and still have this particular system work. And this I think is a very minor matter, considering that over 50 years we have increased the income of the workers by several 100%, not by taking it away from the share of the capitalists, but by increasing productivity, which enables them to have, whereas say there was 100 divided before, and the capitalist got 25, and the workers got 75, using the workers in a rather wider sense. Now it's 400, and the capitalists have got much more. They've got 100, 4 times as much. The workers have got 300, also 4 times as much. This to me is much more important. It is more important because I'm much more concerned with dealing with the poor than with impoverishing the rich.
My watch says 5 up, so I think it's best that we move to A258, and we'll pick up the questions there.
I'd like to ask Professor Lerner to sort of give us his distribution was since you mentioned that one can always print money, and it is well known that, for instance, you print money with the expectation that that money is going to purchase something. And if this money is going to purchase something, it eventually is going to have to be, some kind of wealth has to be backed by this money. And you seem to,
I think I get the question. Can I print wealth? No, you can't print wealth. You can only print money. It's no use printing money if you can't make any more wealth. It's only if we are in a peculiar situation where we have the wherewithal, we have unemployed workers, unemployed machines and materials, but they're not being used because one little screw is missing, namely the money to pay for it. In this special situation, we have the extraordinary miracle, by just printing money we can get the thing going, and we can make it, but only up to the point that we're able to make more goods. Beyond that point, if you keep on printing money, you just try to buy more goods than there aren't anymore, and then you get just rising prices. But as long as we have unemployed resources, it is perfectly possible to print the extra money which is needed, the absence of which is preventing people from going to work and making the things they'd like to enjoy.
Now, I should announce before that we have this room till 3. Professor Lerner has to leave at around 2:30.
So I have learned that traffic is not so bad, I can stay a little longer.
All right. That.
Concerning Professor Lerner's last response, I'd like to ask, since industrial production is dropping for the last 2 years or more, and since the Federal Reserve Board, by law, the United States does have its hand on the faucet simply to turn on more money, since there's plenty of unemployment around, why do we have all this unemployment, unused capacity, and, that's the question. Why do we have, in other words, if your solution is so simple, why hasn't it been solved?
Because I am not the director of the Federal Reserve Board. If I were there, I'd do it differently. I think we should not hold the faucet down. We need more money. Now, this by itself might not help if it simply caused prices to rise, because then the extra money wouldn't be able to buy any more goods. And this is the situation we are in now, and therefore we have to take steps to prevent the increased money which we should have from really working. And to do that, we have to hold down money prices and money wages, which Mr. Marcus keeps on calling austerity, as if I wanted to cut down real wages, which I don't.
I'd like to thank Mr. Marcus for giving us, treating us to a clear indication of what Professor Lerner's economic austerity programs mean in reality. And that is the systematic corporatization and brutalization of the working and peasant classes of the world, which is giving concrete expression in Dr. Lerner's much praised example of the Brazilian economic recovery. However, when confronted with the facts of the Brazilian art, Professor Lerner looked around and simply said, well, perhaps it was a bad example. And I'm sure everybody here in their right mind would agree that the jailing of labor union leaders for 30 years is a bad example. The systematic murder and torture of leftists and students.
Is this coming around to a question?
Eventually.
How eventually?
All these things are bad examples. Yet just a few weeks ago, this was Professor Lerner's best example. Now, obviously, the question that comes out of this is, how can you have your best example one day, and then it's a bad example the next? Do you mean to repudiate the Brazilian economic recovery and all the actions?
May I answer the question? Finally, you got to it?
I have a second question.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. No.
Can I ask the answer?
Let me try to answer this question. His Brazil was a good example last week and is a bad example today. Brazil is a good example of what I'm talking about. It's a bad country, and you mustn't mix the two up.
I'll try to get back to you.
This is really a classic. It's a, good. Brazil has a good economics, but somehow Professor Mueller wants to.
But I have to expect
wants to wash his hands of the political situation. He said exactly the same thing about Germany. He said Hitler did some good things. He got employment, got full employment going again. But somehow I want to wash my hands, says Professor Mueller, essentially of the fascist Nazi regime. I'd like to address this to Mr. Marcus, which is specifically, what is the relationship between the measures which Hitler took and had to take in order to get that so-called good side of Hitler, the full employment, to the phase 1, phase 2 situation which is developing in the U.S.?
This question was addressed to me too, excuse me, because it did deal with what I'm saying. I don't know whether you wish to deny that Hitler increased employment. Are you denying it? Are you closing your eyes to it? Am I not allowed to say it because Hitler's a bad man? It is true, Hitler did it. I don't care who did it. It was done and it worked. Hitler created more money and he spent it and people got jobs. Now, I'm not going to pretend he didn't do it because I don't like the other things he did. Now, the other question is it necessary if somebody does what I did, also to do the thing, what I say you should do, also to do the things which Hitler did? Now, this would be a very serious matter. If it is impossible to create more money without having a fascist state like in Germany or a Bonapartist state like in Brazil. If this were true, I would have to say don't do it because the other things are much more important. And I would even agree to have a lot of unemployment rather than have fascist terror. But I say there's absolutely no reason for supposing this is the case, because we had a recovery from the Depression in this country and in every country, in democratic countries and in socialist countries, where more money was created, and we did not do what Hitler did. And I think it is closing your eyes to say you mustn't say it. It is as if you would say, as if a socialist country, for example, because it hates capitalism, would say we mustn't use electricity because the capitalists use electricity. Hitler used spending more money to give people more jobs. It worked. We can do that, in spite of the fact that he did it.
Yeah. Well, first of all, certain things about the Nazi thing have to be made clear. Again, this Hitler thing is a bad example to use, Professor Lerner, because the effect, Hitler increased more jobs. He took the unemployed and organized them in WPA-type projects. And they went out and doing all kinds of useless things, generally. Digging ditches, anything to keep them busy. It was discipline. The effect of this and of the growth of the war industry, which took place particularly after 1936 onwards, when Germany became really a war economy, was to depress real wages in Germany enormously. There was a catastrophic decline in German real wages even up to World War II. There was a increased intensification of the hours of labor. There were all kinds of increases in taxation, direct and indirect, such that the conditions of life for the German working class were depressed. Now, with the general poverty going down, was by looting Europe. You can get wealth in two general ways. You can get wealth by increasing the amount of wealth produced, or you can get wealth by looting. Domestically, you can loot by using up your existing natural resources, plant and equipment, without replacing them, without restoring them. Domestically, you can also increase the amount of loot available for capital by decreasing wages, real wages. That increases the amount of real wealth which goes to capital. Another method of loot, when this no longer is sufficient, which is Hitler's method, is to loot your neighbors. Loot the plants of your neighbors. Loot the agriculture of your neighbors. Take your neighbor's working class, its peasantry, employ it first as Gastarbeiter. Then employ it as slave labor, the crook system. And you can grind human beings as well as nations. You can grind human beings by slave labor. human beings who represent the embodiment of a certain amount of social wealth which is put in to bring them to an adult condition. Then you take these adults, you feed them on a diet of cooked soup, an intensive 6,000 calorie labor, and after X number of months of cooked soup and 6,000 calorie labor in a cooked plant, and the cooked guards were worse than the SS generally in their behavior, you grind them down so they're depleted. Then you send them back to the SS for replacement parts. And in order for a cost economy, you replace the used up parts into the gas ovens because you thus save the economy the cost of feeding them. This is precisely, now that the capitalist system has used up the possibility of maintaining itself by exploiting the underdeveloped sector, that is, it can continue to exploit it, but the rate of exploitation is insufficient to maintain the advanced sector. The entire capitalist system, advanced sector, is in the same predicament that the German autarky of 1939 was in. It can survive only by looting its domestic populations, and then, of course, the natural thing is to look at the Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, China, and so forth, despite all the present peace talk. Which means that we're now under the capitalist system. We're on a road which heads first of all towards fascism, because you can only impose this austerity upon an organized working class by atomizing it and crushing it. Only by SS, only by taking masses of hippies and white-collar workers, turning them into a Bonapartist wage price control machine. What do you think what's going to happen in phase 3? Masses of white-collar unemployed, including unemployed instructors from Queens College and elsewhere who are being thrown off because of next year. Being thrown off because of austerity in the university system, which means much larger class size. It means part-time instructors are being totally depleted. It means that class sizes and marginal instructors, that is, who haven't got tenure, are going to be off. It's a part of the general depreciation of the standard of living of working class. That some of these white-collar workers who want a job and who have to live will take $4,000, $5,000 a year jobs as bureaucrats for the new Office of Price Administration. Ex-hippies will be recruited to get their bread that way, and they won't care because they don't care about the working class. This legion, and under a condition of total demoralization, we get fascism here and in Europe. And once we get fascism here and in Europe, it'll be a short time before, unless the Soviet Union and Chinese decide to lay down and let the U.S. come in and take them over, we'll have nuclear war and World War III, which may be close to the end of the human race. There is no way of putting this austerity program across. The problem of inflation is it necessary to understand that the present situation, the present economic crisis, is caused by an exhaustion of the very method which Professor Lerner is talking about. And the only method to which they can resort now, which is the other side he's talking about, must be austerity, whether he intends it to be austerity or not. What he's confusing is this, and I'm being long on this, but this is a key question, is that yes, we do have in the real economy, in the war production sector, represents a capital goods potential, which could increase the rate of employment in this country to the point that we could have a 25% annual real growth in the economy. The 25% underutilization of plant and equipment represents a tremendous productive potential. All that exists, but we can't utilize it under the capitalist system. We could utilize it if we could take not the small U.S. debt. We have a $1.7 trillion acknowledged debt in this country, combined public and private debt. 1.7 trillion. It's rising in Europe. That's the debt service, not the pitiful little government debt, U.S. government debt. And the massive stocks which are demanding dividends and payments. The debt service, the landlords which in New York City are getting a bonanza. Actually, Rockefeller's getting a bonanza. These demands of the capitalist system, which are required to sustain the bond and stock market from total collapse, demand that the only kind of implementation of the thing he's proposing must be increasing measures toward that. The reason they don't do it in phase 2 is a political question. Is that phase 2 is directed to discredit, demoralize the organized labor movement to the point that it can be smashed into depression. And if phase 2 doesn't work the way some people think it should, some economists think it would in terms of their abstraction, it's simply because the government plan is a little smarter than some of the economists. And they recognize that they cannot meet the working labor movement head on. What they've got to do is, first of all, demoralize it and discredit it. If that means making some 7% or 8% concessions contrary to the meaningless 5.5, they'll do it because they're getting the larger take. It's by getting the trade union bureaucracy to accept a wage price control policy they discredit the trade union organizations themselves in the eyes of their own members. And that's the first precondition for doing. I just mentioned finally one thing. In 1933, when Hitler took power, there were in Germany large armies, trained fighting squads of the Reichsbahn, which was the Social Democratic Party's fighting squad, ready to take on the Nazis. In addition, there were fighting squads of the Communist Party, who've been fighting the Nazis, knew exactly how to do it. Every other little red group, every trade union group in Germany had fighting squads, already organized, trained, ready to fight, to overthrow Hitler if fascism would come. What happened was that none, not the Social Democracy, not the Communist Party, no one else gave the order to fight. What happened, which pointed this up, was a lunatic out of the Netherlands came wandering through Germany, was so astonished by this lack of resistance that he bought himself a can of kerosene and began setting fire, Flammenwerfer, and finally he set a fire in the Reichstag. That no one in Germany fought. The lesson of that is essentially is that if the phase 2 succeeds in co-opting the trade union leadership to the point that the trade union members no longer have any confidence in their own union organization, then they're totally demoralized. Under those conditions, the kinds of things that Professor Lerner is talking about, which he laments are not occurring today, will occur. They'll occur as phase 3, which would be the introduction of home life.
Let's stop dire predictions. I think Professor Lerner would.
I certainly can't deal with all the things that have been raised. Every time Mr. Martin gets up, he brings up half a dozen new theories, including some peculiar history. Let me just mention one point. I happen to have been interested in the developments in Germany before the Nazi seizure of power. And one of the reasons, well, there are two main reasons why I think Hitler was able to seize power. This is not the topic of this our conversation, but it's come up and it's of interest. One was that the Social Democrats, before Hitler, believed the way Mr. Marcus does, that it is not possible to create money unless you had gold. And therefore they allowed the unemployment to grow, and that is what gave Hitler his chance. The other item was that the Communist Party, following the instructions of Stalin, declared that the greatest enemy of the working class was not Hitler, but the Social Democrats. And it was better to let Hitler get to power, and after him they believed they would get into power. Of course, he killed them instead. These are parts of the history. There are many other things which I cannot do. I will say just one thing. It is often said that to make an economist, you take a parrot and teach it to say supply and demand. And it seems to me now that to make an anti-economist, you have to learn the word austerity and keep on using it after many times being shown this is not what we're talking about.
Here, somebody new. I'll get back to you.
Mr. Lerner, I think I disagree with what you said about Hitler coming into power, because I think this was a political happening. What happened was President Hindenburg, the mailman, stabbed ruining the last democratic force in Germany.
In the first place.
I thought some.
Yeah, this deals directly with the points that you just made in this question. One issue is why Professor Lerner's programs necessarily would have to lead to austerity. And I think it might help to clarify things if you dealt with it in terms of his arguments. In other words, he has said that if you decrease wages and at the same time print a lot of money, this will lead to increased production, increased expansion of goods, and therefore new prosperity. Could you deal with it in terms of his argument to see that the only way to do this would in fact be an austerity program?
Well, in fact, in the past period, particularly since 1966 and especially since 1968, there has already been a decline in real wages in the U.S. economy. And despite all these wage increases, the wage increases, the after-tax disposable income of workers after the wage increases have been on the whole significantly less than the rate of inflation. So that the very argument that there is a correlation between rising wages and inflation is obviously, simply on this empirical fact, is utter nonsense. So therefore, since we already have the policy that Professor Lerner is talking about, that is declining real wages, then it would seem that since 1966 that the problem would have been solved by simply printing more money. Now, if we look at the fiscal activities of the U.S. government
and Federal Reserve System since 1966, we find, in fact, that these policies have been carried out. And with precisely these policies, which were particularly their acceleration following the May 1970 crisis, which led to August 15. So that simply looking at the thing as a phenomenon without examining the internal dynamics of the thing, it's obvious that the recipe he proposed led to a crisis. And therefore his recipe, even on these grounds, doesn't work. And it goes back to the other kind of thing I was talking about.
I'm glad Mr. Marcus thinks it's obvious. I have found in debating with people, whenever I say something is clear or obvious, and they say it's not clear or obvious, I immediately admit defeat. And he says it's not clear, it's not clear. And no matter if I did say it was clear, and it's not obvious to me. I did not say, and again, the same thing comes up again and again, I did not say that we want to cure the thing by reducing real wages. I repeat again, I did not say that I want to reduce real wages. I don't know how many times I should repeat it. Once more, I did not say that I want to reduce real wages. I want to stop the money wages rising by more than productivity, because then it will not mean an increase in real purchasing power by the workers, but they just not pay higher prices. That I want to say again and again. And all this talk about financial and material, financial side, to me is not intelligible. It is not obvious. And I hope that there aren't many people here who think that it must be true because it's complicated. What is true, and it's said very clearly by Mr. Marcus just now, is there is a difference between making useful things and making not useful things. If you build pyramids in the desert, this will not increase the standard of living of the workers, nor will the making of war machines increase the ability to produce peaceful goods. This is certainly true. But you don't have to talk about money about that. This is true about production of goods. Wealth is the production of goods and services. Money happens to be an instrument which enables it to be done more conveniently. And this is being discovered also by the socialist countries, who at one time thought they could manage without money, but found that they were mistaken, and it can be more efficient because they do use money and prices and calculations of cost and even calculations of profit to guide the managers of the socialistic countries. But still it is only a technique for guiding people to tell whether what they are producing is useful or not, whether people want it or whether they don't want it. And this is how the use of money in Russia, for example, came to be used to make it more certain that the factories produce things which the consumers were willing to buy. And before that they have physical criteria and they make things nobody wanted, but would surpass the figures in the 5-year plan, and you had factories full of kettles with holes in them, or kettles too heavy to pick up. When they had to sell them, and this was a test whether they were really producing, they were using the prices, and that is what it is useful for. And the fact that we have had a depression in the last couple of years, which we certainly have had, and that real wages have not gone up the way they could because we are able to produce more, I come back to what's a little bit of economics that I thought I could teach you in this meeting. And that is that there was not enough demand. People weren't buying enough of the product to make it worthwhile for the shopkeepers to order it from the wholesalers, and the wholesalers didn't order it from the factories, and the factories didn't employ the people because there was not enough spending, not because there was some $1,700 billion worth of debt and credit created.
Mr. Lasker, do you believe that Mr. Conway's new plan will have deleterious effects on the working class's economy?
Well, you see, here again we have a difficulty. Many of Mr. Conway's plans I think are very bad. Some of them I think are good. And I asked and I've mentioned some which I'm in favor of. Now, insofar as he is endeavoring to carry out a policy which will prevent money wages from rising more than 5.5% or whatever it is, this is a good thing. Because if this is so, and prices will not be allowed to go out of line with costs, we already are now having tremendous screams because the increase in the wages of coal miners is not being allowed to be passed on in the price of coal, in spite of Mr. Marcus saying there's no connection between wages and costs and prices. we see that the price of coal is going up because more have to be paid to the coal miners. So they're not allowed to pass it all on. Now, this is, if this succeeds in general, this will mean there will be less inflation. If there is less inflation, there will be less drive for cutting down on total spending, and if there's less cutting down on total spending, there will be more jobs. And that's what I'm in favor of.
Way back there.
I'd like to ask Dr. Lerner this. Since that things are produced because there's not a demand, what's with the problem of housing? Is that because there's not a demand? You can, suck the blood out of people living in a ghetto? I'm not finished. I understand also in all of this question. We suck the blood out of people in ghettos for $170 a month or more. Or in fact, is this a problem because people who speculate on the real estate market, who actually drain the country and the world, of real wealth by not putting anything into housing, but merely by speculating, telling banks we can get this amount of rent out of housing, and then doing it. Or is the reason because not enough people want good housing?
No, things are not produced just because people would like to have them. You have to pay for it, and you have to pay what it costs. Otherwise, people won't produce it. And of course, there is a convention that landlords are bloodsuckers because they have to be paid enough to be able to maintain the houses, and they're often not paid enough to be able to maintain. Allow me, excuse me. Many landlords are now not being paid enough to make it worth their while to keep their houses. They've been abandoning houses because they're not receiving enough rent to what it costs. They've been presenting houses to tenants, and tenants refuse to take them because they like the landlord to keep on keeping their houses up. Now, of course, houses are difficult to make. You have to pay great high wages to builders and so on. This is one of the reasons why it's expensive and why you don't go into the house building industry. Now, if you're concerned about people not having houses, what you should do is to go and build some houses. And you should borrow some money. And that's what's needed. What is wrong with housing is not rent, but there are not enough houses. There are not enough houses because in this system, people will only produce something if they can cover their costs and make a profit. If you don't allow this to work, you must do some other method. There are other methods too. The government could build houses for everybody and charge no rent. As a tenant, I'd love it. As a taxpayer, I wouldn't.
Yes, two questions directly. Professor Lerner.
We wanted to answer that.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't see. We'll get to you.
This problem of rent is a good one. First of all, in New York City, you've got two problems to consider. They both exemplify the whole problem of the economy on rent. First of all, in respect to existing structures, particularly middle to low income structures, is that the capital valuation of these structures has no relationship to reality in terms of either a depreciated original cost or in relationship to the actual maintenance cost. We have in New York is a tremendous mortgage structure, including purchase mortgage structures, which is tied in through rediscounting and discounting of real estate funds into the major banks of the entire world, which are either situated here indirectly. Rent in New York is not the payment of maintenance and depreciation, or even that plus a profit. Rent is essentially a maintenance on the basis of a price-earnings ratio of a fabulous, fictitious expansion in mortgage and realty property. There's no value behind it. It's a pure swindle. Now, what happens is under a court ruling which occurred in connection with the Kennedy properties held in the Lincoln Center area, in which the landlord is supposed to get a fair rate of return on his property if it's taken over by eminent domain or similar arrangements, that this price of slum properties, which are actually worthless properties, but which have a high mortgage structure and a high earning structure because of ghetto rent, that the problem of acquiring land for construction in New York is predicated upon the value of a worthless piece of property. And thus you can't even build new properties in New York for low-income housing and still pay these acquisition costs. Established ratios. And on the basis of those previously established ratios, you're simply going to have a perpetuation of the same problem. That's why you can't do it. The only way in which you can solve these problems, coming back to the real side, is, yes, we do have the productive capacity thing off our back. In order to get this thing off our back, you have to destroy the existing values of stocks, mortgages, etc., and which means to destroy the capitalist system. So my point is, you've reached the point, and the housing problem really exemplifies it. You've reached the point where the human race and the capitalist system can no longer exist side by side. One of the two has to be chosen, either the capitalist system or the human race.
We just have one last question. This person I interrupted, I hope it's short because it's about
Professor Lerner, you tried to show that your main consideration has been non-political, solely dealing with the economy. While Mr. Marcus has contended that your program, willingly or not, will lead to some type of fascist government, what I'd like to ask is that, despite the fact that it's been accepted that your main consideration has been academic and not political, could there be some link with the fact that you're a member of the University Center for Rational Alternatives, led by Mr. Sidney Hook, which has in the past tried to frame up Angela Davis, or did a good job in that too in California, plus the fact that it has done quite a bit in the U.S. to get radicals off campus and to get communists out of their jobs in the U.S. And if this, plus the fact that you were an advisor to a semi-fascist state in Brazil, if this somehow links up with the fact that you're proposing an austerity, wage gouging, union-busting alternative for the U.S.
Now this is for party.
You have just had a beautiful example of what I called an amalgam. I was not incidentally an advisor. I don't know the answer to that kind of question. I was not an advisor to the Brazilian government, nor that this is relevant. I probably would have advised them if they'd asked me to. Sidney Hook is a man whom I greatly honor and respect. He is a man who wants to keep universities as universities, to teach people and let everybody teach in universities what they think, whatever it is that they think. And the idea that Sidney Hook is in any way obsessive is pure slander. Nor has it anything to do with the topic of this debate. And I think maybe I shouldn't say any more. There was something else which was relevant to economics, but I've forgotten what it was. Anyway, we had a beautiful example of bringing up all sorts of irrelevant personal things to, as if all these things were true. Suppose I were a fascist. Suppose Sidney Hook were a fascist. Suppose that this organization to which I belong were a fascist organization. What I have said today and teach in my courses is still just as true and is completely irrelevant, even though it happens to be wrong. Thank you very much.
It's 3 o'clock. Sorry.
And now there is too little. And so we have the unemployment as the worst result of the inflation, even though it is due to the cure rather than to the disease. But the cure is worse than the disease, and we are in a situation where, in order to remove the cure, we have to remove the disease. To remove the disease, we have to regulate wages and prices to stop them from rising the way they do. And if we succeed in that, we can then take measures to increase the total amount of spending, because there will not then be so many people who will say, you mustn't do that because it's inflationary. And then you will have more employment, more jobs for everybody, and this is the reason why I think it'd be a good idea to check increases in wages and in prices. Now, I probably have used up the time which I have, or do I have some more time? Oh, good. What is needed then is to do something to stop this, and then we can have a policy of increasing the total amount of spending. Now these things are being done extremely badly by the present government. When the new economic policy was first spelled out, announced, it included the suggestion that steps would be taken to to increase total spending, to increase the number of jobs. This has not been done. It was not done because of the very same pressures which brought about the depression in the first place. And people said, oh, it's inflationary to have a deficit. And so while the usually when I give a lecture somewhere, I say I'm very glad to be here. And usually I am. This time it wouldn't be true. The only reason I'm here is because I promised to do so. And I certainly would have not come here if I had not promised, after seeing the voluminous literature which has been appearing in connection with this meeting. I'm used to being told that I'm wrong. I'm used to being told that I'm too abstract. I'm used to people disagreeing with me. And sometimes I am wrong and am too abstract. I'm not clear. I'm not used to being called a liar, or being called incompetent, or being called a fascist. And this sort of thing makes me very unhappy to come to places where this is the nature of the kind of things going on. I was also warned, apparently unnecessarily, so far everything is behaving very well. I was told this is liable to be a shouting match rather than a debate. And I'm willing to concede right at the beginning that I'm not able to shout as loud as some others. I'm willing to bow out that this would be the kind of thing. However, I am here, and I am a teacher, and I like to teach. And so I will take a few minutes to talk about something which I know something about, I think, which I think I have some competence in spite of all the letters in the press here. And I will not try to deal with four problems, which is apparently what the people who organized the debate wanted me to do. Instead, I will try to lay down what seem to me the basic propositions of the nature of the new economic policy produced by President Nixon and the things which I think it can achieve. One more word before I go on to that. In the course of the discussion, letters, and the broadside, I've also been accused of being a kind of sadist. That is, that I love to reduce the standard of living of the working people, to grind their faces in the dust, I think is the proper expression for this. And that is because I have been against increasing wages, and in fact, on some occasions, I have proposed a decrease in wages. Now, in the context, this must be understood, that I did not believe ever that this decrease in wages would make the workers any poorer or have less things to eat. It was clearly understood that there was a decrease in money wages which would make it avoid the inflation, so that they would be just as well off with the wage, with the lower money wage, as with the higher money wage. The most important difference being that there will be more work for more people, which I am in favor of. But apparently I thought this should not be necessary to emphasize, but apparently it is necessary, judging by the letters, etc. Now, what is the new economic policy? There are a few very simple propositions, which seem to be disputed by the people who organized this meeting, with arguments to which my normal would say pass it on in charging higher prices. And they each blame each other, and possibly even quite sincerely. The employers say we must raise the prices because our costs are going up, and they are, because the wages are rising. And the representatives of the workers say we must raise our wages because the prices are going up, and that is also true. And so we have each blaming each other, and you have to find out which came first, chicken or the egg, and of course there's no sensible answer in doing that. What needs to be done is to remove the cause. The cause is the pressure of wages and of prices to go up because of the bargaining power which the workers have and because of the market power which the businessmen have. And the attempt by the new economic policy is to curtail this power, the result of which would be to check the inflation. That is not the most important part of it. The thing is serious not because of the inflation, which at the present rate doesn't do any terrible harm. Other countries are managing with much greater inflation and having greater prosperity and employment, which is more important than that prices are rising. The really important thing is that the attempt to stop the inflation is taking place by people who think it is the first kind of inflation, that it is due to too much spending. And so measures have been taken by the government, by the central banks, to cut down on the total amount of spending on the ground that this is supposed to be the cause of the inflation. The result of that is that there is less spending and there wasn't too much. The point is, why don't you learn this economics? We're having an inflation in which prices are rising. Inflation often happens because people are spending too much money trying to buy more than is available to be bought. Whenever this happens, the prices have to rise, and if that is the nature of the inflation, the cure for it is to remove the cause, which is usually the way of curing anything satisfactorily. And in this case, the cause would be that there is too much spending, and this can be done by the government taking money away from people so they shouldn't be able to spend so much, and then they'll be able to buy the same thing without the increase in price. This, however, is not the nature of the inflation we are having now. It does not make sense to say that there is too much spending when we are having 6% unemployed, when we have managed not long ago with only 3.5% unemployed. We have more unemployed because the spending is not enough to buy all the goods which could be produced, which is why people are not producing them, since the employers will not employ people to make goods which they can't sell. There is not enough spending. So we cannot say the inflation is due to too much spending. It is then due to something else. What it is due to is the power of the sellers, not of the buyers, to raise the prices. The workers raise the wages, the employers raise the prices. The employers agree to pay the higher money wages because they